Greetings, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Tamar Sternthal, and I'm Director of Camera's Israel office. Just a couple of years after I moved to Israel in 2004, the seeds were planted for a Hebrew language division of Camera. Haaretz, the Israeli daily, highly influential abroad, greatly helped with that. In 2004, veteran columnist Gideon Levy had claimed that Golda Meir once said that after what the Nazis did to us, we can do whatever we want. The Jewish Journal of Los Angeles reprinted the quote, citing Haaretz. When I confronted Levy asking for his source, he acknowledged that he could not produce one. Nevertheless, Haaretz rebuffed requests to correct the record. Not only that, in 2005, in response to a correction request regarding a different pernicious falsehood, a Haaretz editor accidentally forwarded me an internal email. It said, "We have a quasi-policy to ignore this organization Camera and all of its complaints. Otherwise, we will never finish with them." The challenges of prompting more accurate news coverage within the Israeli context are unique. For instance, accountability, a concept encoded within American journalistic standards, has no exact translation in Hebrew. Indeed, the American practice in which leading national papers publish corrections on virtually a daily basis does not exist in Israel. It is also important to understand that Israelis freely employ loaded language among themselves, and sometimes even in international settings, with zero understanding of the toxic reverberations abroad. It became clear that native Hebrew speakers deeply familiar with the local media scene were needed to effectively take on the journalistic shortcomings of the Israeli media. In addition to dialoguing with Israeli journalists and instilling principles of professional responsibility and accountability, Camera envisions a Hebrew site which would educate the Israeli public about misinformation defaming their country, both in Israel and abroad. Since its 2010 launch, Perspectiva, Camera's Hebrew division, has established itself as a leading Israeli voice, calling for professional, accurate news coverage. No longer can journalists at Haaretz or elsewhere afford to dismiss Camera. Israeli journalists now have a local outfit and audience holding them accountable, putting them on the defensive in Hebrew on Twitter, television, and radio. I have the pleasure of introducing Hanan Amiur, Editor-in-Chief of Perspectiva, to share with you Perspectiva's impact. We'll hear from Hanan for about 25 minutes, then go to Q&A. I will begin with some questions of my own, and then you will all have the opportunity to submit your own written questions. If you run your cursor along the bottom of your screen, you'll see an icon for Q&A. Click there to type in questions during the talk. And with that, Hanan, it's all yours.
Thank you for that introduction, Tamar, and thank you to the audience for joining us. I'm honored to share with you Perspectiva's work in Israel. I'll start with some background on what led to the establishment of Camera's Hebrew language division. In 2007, Camera became concerned that a fair amount of the misinformation about Israel appearing in the international media originates right here with the Israeli press. For example, a common false claim frequently found in the American press at that time was that Jewish-only roads serve Israelis in the West Bank. The implication and the time outright accusation was that these supposedly Jewish-only routes are proof of Israeli apartheid. The truth is that there are parts of certain West Bank roads prohibited to Palestinians, but they are open to all Israelis, Jews, Muslims, and Christians alike. Since the restrictions are based on nationality, not religion or ethnicity, the apartheid smear is baseless. Nevertheless, Haaretz, an Israeli paper, very influential with foreign journalists covering Israel, had frequently reported the Jewish-only roads lie, and also regularly accused Israel of apartheid. Coming from an Israeli source, the myth gained greater credibility. When Camera first exposed Haaretz's Jewish-only roads falsehood in 2005, the publisher defended the claim. As Haaretz writers clung to the falsehood in the following years, it becomes clear to camera that the local Hebrew language site was needed in Israel to systematically monitor the local media and hold it accountable before the Israeli public. Perspectiva launched in 2010. The same year marked a turning point as Haaretz dropped the Jewish-only roads lie. Also in 2010, Camera prompted correction of the falsehood at the Associated Press, Boston Globe, Washington Post, and CNN. The Jewish-only roads now rarely appears in Western media reports. Perspectiva aims to counter anti-Israeli falsehood at their outset here in Israel before they are exported abroad. Now, quiet and polite requests to correct erroneous reports might work with the American press, but the Israeli public discourse is more direct, blunt, and fiery. Perspectiva must take this environment into account to effectively deal with journalists whose unfair criticism of Israel are based on lies, distortions of facts, and ethical failures. What does work? Deterrence. And how do we create deterrence? With effective criticism that has wide audience, compelling journalists to respond and improve their coverage. Years of experience have demonstrated that by naming and shaming journalists, we compel them to be more careful, to get their facts right, and to abide by the principles of journalism. Much of the Israeli media is highly critical of Israel on a variety of issues. Some journalists responsibly base their critical coverage on correct facts and work according to the standards of professional journalism. We don't take issue with this kind of criticism. Justified media criticism of Israel is not only permissible, it is also an essential part of our vibrant democracy. Israel isn't immune to mistakes, and when it does make mistakes, it's not immune from public criticism. Our activity focuses on unjustified and mostly malicious criticism against Israel, its citizens, and army. A unique challenge that we face here in Israel is that the practice correcting false reports is not very widespread in the Israeli press. While Camera regularly prompts corrections in US media outlets, print and broadcast, large and small, that is much more of an uphill battle in Israel. For that reason, the story that I'm about to tell you about a restriction we prompted last year on a leading Israeli television network is particularly significant. This case demonstrates the harm, the lies that journalists can purvey by concealing information and the power of exposing it withheld information. In August 2019, the main edition of Channel 13, which is widely watched in Israel, aired a long and disturbing story about extremist and racist lessons taught to students at the pre-military college Otzem. The Channel 13 segment featured video excerpts from the classes, which had been available on the college site. In the broadcast, Rabbi Asaf Namburg is seen making terrible statements against Arabs, leftist and secular people, saying they should be avoided at all costs, even if that meant not enlisting in the army. The item was difficult to watch. With great fervor, Namburg harshly confronted a student who objected, speaking in favor of military service. The state-funded academy was founded by Rabbi Rafi Peretz, who was then Israel's education minister, and had previously served as the Israeli army's chief rabbi. Otzem is not some marginal institution, but a mainstream academy which educates highly motivated modern Orthodox youth to prepare for a meaningful year of army service. During the broadcast, Channel 13's education correspondent emphasized the institution's ties with Rafi Peretz. The journalist left viewers with the question, why does the state deliver public funding to that college if this is what they teach their students? As expected, the story created a great sensation. The media and political responses were fast and furious. Numerous other Israeli media outlets covered Channel 13's report. Political figures, including members of Knesset, denounced the affair, calling it, for example, a shameful horror show and labeling Otzem a dangerous college that needs to shut down. As soon as I saw the item, it was clear to me, as it would be to others who are familiar with the world of pre-military colleges, that there was zero chance that Naumburg has spoken to his students in the way that Channel 13 claimed. I decided to do some research on the story. It took me several days to convince Otzem College to provide me with the full videos of the classes, which by then were no longer available in the Academy's site. School officials had no trust in the media and didn't believe there was a chance to set the record straight. But I didn't let go. Finally, they complied and gave me the footage. Well, after just a few minutes of watching the unedited footage, it was very clear that Channel 13 maliciously excerpted select parts of Naumburg's words, ripping statements from their context and changing their meaning by 180 degrees. In the unedited footage, they proceeded the awful statements shown in the broadcast. Naumburg repeatedly and clearly said that he is role-playing, presenting a position that is not his own, but which he said represents the ultra-Orthodox view. The journalist simply took sentences and even parts of sentences out of their proper context. Furthermore, in other classes that the journalist later admitted to me that he had watched, Rabbi Naumburg expressed his actual views. There he spoke with deep love and appreciation of the Israeli left wing and secular Israelis. Of his political opponents on the left, for example, he said, "My basic viewpoint is that we are in the same boat. This is my boat. I don't have another boat." About the Arabs, he said, for another example, "Also hatred of Arabs is horrible thing. It's a terrible thing. It's racism. It is despicable. What is this? We don't hate people." His message was one of national unity. Channel 13's label, which reached far and wide in the Israeli public discourse, points to an unbelievable level of ignorance or pure malice on the part of the journalist and his editors. How could they think that a rabbi in Otzem College would preach to his students what they claimed that he preached? Anyone with a passing familiarity with the world of pre-military colleges knows that this is completely absurd. The college takes great pride in its graduates who enlist to a meaningful military service, integrate in the Israeli society, and promote values of Israeli unity and solidarity. That's the whole purpose of their education in the college. The journalist was dismissive when Perspectiva approached him with our findings. Only after we exposed the affair with a report on our website and with my interview on Kan Channel 11, one of Israel's leading major networks, did the people at Channel 13 realize that they were in trouble. They deleted the item from their website, apologized to Rabbi Naumburg, and suspended the journalist from his position as education correspondent. Perspectiva's investigation received national attention as one of the top 5 news stories that week. It put Channel 13's false story to rest and prompted many journalists and public figures to apologize. Well, over a year later, the journalist still is not permitted to report on education, and Channel 13 is currently dealing with a big defamation lawsuit filed by Otzem College and Rabbi Naumburg. This wasn't the first time that the Israeli media did this injustice to pre-military colleges rabbis by removing from context parts of their remarks to present them in a bad light. But since then, the Israeli media has stopped using this tactic. That ugly phenomenon had disappeared from our review, at least until now. One another significant long-term impact that we have made is putting the gaps between the Hebrew and English editions of Haaretz on the Israeli public agenda. While Haaretz Hebrew edition is read by only a tiny percentage of Israelis, the English paper is very influential with foreign journalists, diplomats, and policymakers. Haaretz English edition is the most influential Israeli media outlet in the international realm. Over the years, since 2011, camera has documented scores of instances in which Haaretz English edition whitewashed, downplayed, or entirely omitted information about Palestinians' violence or misdeeds. In some instances, the English accounts is completely at odds with the Hebrew original. Sometimes the English edition adds in false information reflecting negatively on Israel, which did not appear in Hebrew. We have succeeded in getting many of them corrected. In 2016, Perspectiva achieved a turning point with the Haaretz translations problems, putting the issue on the public agenda. That year, Israeli soldier Elor Azaria shot dead a wounded Palestinian attacker who had stabbed a soldier in Hebron. Perspectiva documented a significant difference in Haaretz coverage of the Azaria case in Hebrew versus English. The Hebrew story tags, for instance, referred to the soldier who shot a terrorist. The tag in English was Hebron shooting. No terrorist, no attack, only shooting with no context. This framing continued this way through just about all the coverage. Perspectiva founded 9 parallel Hebrew and English headlines in which the Hebrew called the Palestinian who was shot by the soldier a wounded terrorist. The English headlines, in contrast, referred to the shooting of a hurt Palestinian, a wounded man, a prone Palestinian, a wounded Palestinian, a supine Palestinian, and more, but not terrorist, attacker, assailant, or stabber. In just 2 items, Haaretz in English had referred to the Palestinian as an attacker. After Perspectiva's expose on Haaretz English coverage of the Azaria incident, people on social media began making fun of Haaretz translations and even opened a satirical Facebook page for that purpose. Moreover, for more than a year, the editor and publisher of Haaretz faced tough questions in radio and television interviews about distortions in their English edition. In April 2016, for example, Channel 2 journalist Avri Gilad interviewed editor Aluf Ben. Gilad said to Ben, "There is a feeling I am really trying to tone down my feelings about your paper that you have adopted in some manner the Palestinian technique, but with an interesting twist. The Palestinian speaks nicely to their English, to the English word, and when they speak to their audience, their speech is ugly. You do the opposite. In Hebrew, you speak moderately. But when you speak to the outside world in English, you say terrible things." Ben, the editor, answered, I don't think so. But Gilad persisted, saying, "I will show you. For example, Palestinian woman shot. She was, as it happens, a murderer." Globes, the Wall Street Journal of Israel, published an in-depth feature on Haaretz translation problems, including an interview with me and a chart with many examples from our research. While Haaretz skewed translations have not completely disappeared since then, their pace has seemed to have slowed. And the fact that the Israeli public is aware of the problem changed the dynamic, making editors more sensitive to criticism. Of course, not all of Haaretz's misinformations can be blamed on the English edition. In 2017, Haaretz reported in Hebrew and English about the funeral of a wanted terrorist Palestinian Basel El-Arj, who was killed by Israeli troops after opening fire toward them. In both languages, Haaretz reported that El-Arj was wanted, that he was a leader in the anti-Israel boycott movement, and that he opposed security cooperation between Israel and the Palestinians. The English edition also added that he was a young and notable Palestinian intellectual. From these reports, readers would understand that a dark regime killed a non-violent boycott activist. The publisher of Haaretz was livid when we published about this story. He called us deceitful and threatened that Haaretz is about to expose us soon. He didn't elaborate on what exactly they were going to expose. 4 years went by and we're still waiting. Since we have nothing to hide, his fierce reaction shows us that we're on the right track. But the journalists' reactions are not only negative. Senior Haaretz figures have acknowledged appreciation for our work, that the criticism that we direct at their media outlet. These journalists even publicly voice positive comments on Twitter conversations viewed by many. But what matters to us most is results, not nice words of encouragement from journalists. At times, journalists defend their coverage, but then quietly make a change, taking our criticism into account. And of course, we are happy about this improvement. In a recent example, last month, we took Noah Landau, Haaretz diplomatic correspondent, to task for the headline which stated, "Trump says the next Abraham Accord steps will take place after US elections." The headline completely covered up the big story. The headline should have been, "Trump says that 9 or 10 more countries will follow the lead of the UAE, Bahrain, Saudi Arabia in making peace with Israel." On Twitter, Landau rejected our criticism, but despite our complaints, the headline was immediately corrected, and in both Hebrew and English now reflects that important news. This interaction with our diplomatic correspondent is not unusual. We maintain regular and consistent contact with many of the most highly regarded journalists and editors in Israel, including editors-in-chief. In most of those respectful conversations, journalists and editors request that we moderate or delete our critiques. Their concerns about what we write demonstrates that we have reached an influential position in the Israeli discourse. Not long ago, a media consultant for a government ministry told me that the Haaretz reporters who turned to him for information repeatedly told him that they must be very accurate in the details they publish. Otherwise, Perspectiva would post about them, and they are very much not interested in that. Those stories reflect the process that we have gone through. During the first years, when we are just starting out and we were relatively unknown, the media usually ignored our criticism. But since then, we have become a leading player in the field of Israeli media criticism, an influential force with a prominent position in the public discourse. Our solid, serious criticism have gained widespread recognition. Senior journalists and prominent Israeli media stars cited Perspectiva work in their articles, Facebook accounts, and TV shows. In their popular Facebook and Twitter accounts, they compliment our high professional standards and recommended us to their followers. On our own Facebook page, we have more than 21,000 followers. In proportional terms, based on Israel's population size, that's equivalent to an American Facebook page with more than 1 million followers. I believe, by the way, that we have the potential to triple our reach, and we will do it. We will achieve it. We also appear in the Israeli media, on television and radio several times a week, sharing our observation about distorted and inaccurate Israeli media reports. Finally, on a personal note, I'm excited to share that soon my Hebrew book, Manipulating Public Opinion, 6 Ways the Israeli Media Tells You What to Think, will shortly be published. I hope and believe that the book will strengthen even further our position in the public discourse, expose us to a wider audience, and will contribute significantly to improving the professional level of the Israeli media. It might not be so polite to say, but I'm Israeli, so I will be blunt. I hope Israeli journalists will continue to fear our criticism and be more accurate, fair, and responsible, even if it means they put me out of work. Thank you for all very much for your support of Camera and Perspectiva. Tamar.
Thank you, Hanan. That was really very informative. As Camera's point person on English language Israeli media, I must say I owe Perspectiva a debt of gratitude. Because of your impact, my job prompting correction in Haaretz's English edition is easier and more successful. Just today, for instance, Camera has prompted a correction in Haaretz's English print edition. Yesterday, a large front page photograph, it took up 6 columns on the front page of the print edition, showed a crowd of tightly packed Ethiopian Jews celebrating the Sid holiday, and it carried a caption saying that the Jerusalem event took place on Monday. There was not a mask in sight, no social distancing. The item depicted mass violation of coronavirus regulations on the part of Ethiopian Jewry. Camera contacted Haaretz and raised the likelihood that the photograph was probably from another year. Today, Haaretz commendably clarified that indeed the scene is from 2018 and that the holidays events this year were in compliance with COVID restrictions. I can't say that a dozen years ago that correction would have happened. Your impact is well beyond the Hebrew reports you correct. We have a lot of questions from the audience. I have a few of my own, and I think I'm able to incorporate some of what have appeared with what I had wanted to ask in any event. You spoke a great deal, Hanan, about Haaretz because it is the most influential Israeli outlet internationally and because it spreads the most misinformation about Israel. Can you share some recent Perspectiva work on other Israeli media outlets? And somebody also asked, which do you find the most routinely or reliably inaccurate aside from Haaretz?
I'll start with the second question. I think that the most inaccurate thing that they claim is about the behaving of Israeli soldiers in the field, in the contact with Palestinians. They can claim for violence when there were no violence, or for behaving bad when the opposite happened. It happened when the Palestinians, they have cameras and they take pictures, take photos, take videos of the Israeli soldiers, and like I said in Channel 13's case, put it out of context, cut it, and try to say the opposite about things that happened. And usually we go after the unedited footage again and expose the lie.
The kind of case that you just raised about false claims about Israeli army conduct, I remember for asking about other media outlets, we had a very significant case several years ago with Ynet. There was a story that claimed, did you remember the details, or do you want me to tell?
Yeah.
Okay, a story that claimed that a Palestinian youth was being detained by Israeli forces after he was throwing stones, and that his mother repeatedly requested to accompany him in the army vehicle, and that she was not allowed. Meanwhile, there was footage from the NGO B'Tselem, and if you understood the Hebrew, you could hear her, the soldier saying, "Are you the mother? Are you the mother? Get in the car with him, get in the vehicle." And there were some Palestinians there who pulled the mother back, not allowing her to get on. And that really brings me to another question, Hanan. Maybe we'll get back to other cases of other media outlets. But the question I wanted to ask, are there any Israeli codes of journalistic ethics, and is there a professional body to enforce them?
Yeah, we have our Israeli Press Council and the Journalist Union of Tel Aviv, but it should be their role to do exactly that. But actually, they are part of the system. They are all friends with each other, and they took us aside, and they always against claims. I mean, they don't. We can't trust them that if we will ask them how can it happen. For example, the story that you just said about Ynet, they will ask Ynet how come you do such a thing. They will say Ynet was right and you're wrong. So we don't have we have those institutions, but they are not doing their job at all.
In the Ynet case, that wasn't that was when we actually filed a complaint, and they ruled in our favor. But what we found was, even if they take the right step and the press council makes the correct decision, they have no power of enforcement. Ynet, they said, Ynet, you have to publish a correction, and Ynet refused. So instead, they took the story to Ma'ariv, and Ma'ariv published that the press council ruled against Ynet, and that Ynet is supposed to correct, but they never did. So unfortunately,
they don't have tools. That's another problem.
We're not effective. Yes.
Yeah. You asked me about stories about other outlets.
Other media outlets.
For example, we have a newspaper in Israel, Makor Rishon, and their editor-in-chief claimed that the Ministry of Defense of Lebanon said that they are going to bomb Tel Aviv in order, to. Well, actually, it wasn't true, and we show everybody the video, and when she didn't actually said so, or Globes, the story of Globes, which is like the Wall Street Journal of Israel, they claimed a false claim about the Saudi peace initiative. They claimed that it's good for Israel, but without admit that the right of return is part. I mean, the far right of return is part of this initiative. So we asked them also to correct that. And the Israel Hayom, we had a story with them just 2 or 3 weeks ago about something related to the IHRA anti-Semite definition.
The International Holocaust.
They claimed something about the Europe statement, which wasn't correct, and we correct them also.
The Emirat, I believe it was one of the states, Arab states, which recently normalized. I think it was the Emiratis that expressed support for that, or adopted maybe even the IHRA definition. And one of their columnists said, "Oh, look, the Gulf state can do this, but the Europeans reject it." Meanwhile, the European countries have all accepted. Not all, but many European countries have accepted the IHRA.
In our website, everybody can see in our website, there is a lot of stories about other outlets beside Haaretz. Although Haaretz is, they give us a lot of work.
And I absolutely, the most egregious examples and the most regular examples come out of that media outlet. But you certainly do cover a lot of territory in other media outlets as well. And we did have a question about also on the English side, other English language Israeli media outlets, and that's the area that I cover. So I'll just quickly address. Absolutely, just today we have a correction in the Jerusalem Post, which had reproduced a Reuters story, which referred to Palestinian soldiers, but there is no, per the Oslo Accords, there is no army permitted for the Palestinians. They have the civil defense forces, they have police. We had a correction in Israel Hayom, as you mentioned, Israel Hayom. Also, we had a correction. It was based on a story that came out of the Sky News Arabia, which appeared first in Arabic and then appeared in Hebrew at Israel Hayom, which overstated Israeli support for normalization. And they corrected that in Hebrew. They corrected it in English as well. And we had another English language correction from Israel Hayom in recent days. We just wrote to Ynet today, Ynet in English, also had the error about the Palestinian soldiers. They have yet to correct. And in Haaretz's favor, I would say that they're among the most responsive. Times of Israel also we're in communication a lot about factual errors, and they are very fast to correct them. So we do cover all the major English language Israeli media outlets, but again, Haaretz is the most relied upon by the International Press Corps. Okay, you've talked to me before about the role that you believe Perspectiva has to educate the Israeli public. And I mentioned in my opening remarks about the misinformation that is pervaded about Israel abroad and also in their local press. But how else does Perspectiva, and what other areas does Perspectiva educate local Israelis?
Well, I want everybody in Israel, our followers, people who have the access to the information, who read and follow the news, to be Perspectiva's researcher. I want to give them the tools to read the story, to understand that it's based on inaccurate facts, to have the tools how to find the accurate facts, and how to upload it, to post it, to publish it in an effective way. Because I want everybody to see how we do what we do, and to do it by themselves. And when everybody in Israel, the much that we can, will have the ability to do so, our media will have to be better and better.
Great, thank you, Hanan. I just want to make a point clear in case it hasn't been clear until now, and that is both of us have talked about the corrections that we prompt and that we place such an emphasis on corrections. And I don't think it's always understood for our supporters, even people who know our work, the importance of corrections and why they matter so much. Like the correction today in Haaretz, it was in page 4. I was looking for it and I missed it, but the original error was on page 1. So how does that help? If somebody who knew about it and was looking for it couldn't even find it, how does it help anyone? And the most important impact that corrections have is internally within the news organization, within the journalist himself, less so for the individual reader. And beyond the internal news establishment of that particular media outlet, it has an impact on other reports and other media outlets. So when we prompt a correction on an important issue at a leading media outlet, if Haaretz corrected on Jewish-only roads, I can then take that correction, like you described so well earlier tonight, and get the Boston Globe to correct it, CNN, the Associated Press, and of course, if the Associated Press corrects it, then that goes into newspapers all over the world. And going forward, journalists begin to internalize the correct information, to know that's wrong, and not to continue perpetuating and repeating the misinformation, and it puts a stop to it. Also, in the digital age, the corrections are made to the digital article. The best practice for correcting is to append a correction right there, signifying that the article has been changed, and it shows transparency and readers understand what was wrong and what's correct now. Also for researchers, students who are doing research, or other journalists, policymakers, diplomats who use research tools like LexisNexis, you see the correct information appended to the article, and it's very clear to see what's wrong. And in that way, the misinformation does not get rehashed over and over and over again and live on. So that is why the corrections are so important. I'm going to ask one last question of my own before I open it up to all the many terrific questions that are coming in. And it's again on corrections. Does Perspectiva ever correct errors that go in the opposite direction, meaning that paint Israel in a better light rather than a worse light?
Yes. For example, from let's say 3 weeks ago or a month ago, Israel Hayom quoted a poll in the Arab world which claim that the vast majority of the Arab world support the peace agreements between Israel and the Gulf states. But unfortunately, it wasn't accurate. The numbers, the real numbers, were much under the numbers that Israel claimed, and we said, listen, it's good enough without take the numbers up. The real numbers are those, and that we have to be accurate in both sides.
That's right. Yeah, the numbers, by the way, it was a really interesting poll that came out of the Zogby Research Institute that found it researched the public opinion about many different issues, including normalization in Saudi Arabia, in Jordan, among the Palestinians. And except for the Palestinians, there was actually a surprisingly very high percentage that were approved of the normalization with Israel, most of them in the 40s. But the reports that said the majority, and they put like 70, 60, 70, they bumped those numbers up. So we're all in favor of, getting positive news of Israel about that out there, but let's not exaggerate. Let's keep it.
Exactly.
Let's keep it real.
Let's not exaggerate. The situation is good enough without that.
Right. So we have a question here, obviously from a letter writer of ours, and thank you to the many letter writers who write usually to the American media, but also media outlets here in Israel. Many letters appear in the Jerusalem Post from members of the camera letter writing team. And are these important to discussions in Israel?
What again? Again, the question?
The letters from readers that are published in the Jerusalem Post, many of them are from our camera letter writers. And are these important to discussions in Israel? And Hanan, I should be clear, Hanan is very much in the Hebrew language world and not as aware as what's going on.
I think that
from your point of view with the Hebrew speakers, yes.
I think that readers' letters is not, to be honest, I don't read that part in the newspaper, in anyone, and I don't see any discussion about that. I don't think that I think our tools to deal with those problems should be in other, at least in the Israeli arena, in other ways, not in writing letters. Although even if the newspaper published those letters, because who reads that?
As I suspected, Hanan, your answer is very different than mine, because again, this is why we needed the local Israeli mind to deal with the Israeli mindset, the Israeli media, and its unique characteristics. Speaking as an Ola, an American-Canadian expatriate who's been living in Israel for some 15 years or so now, I can say that the community here of English speakers very much looks to letters in the Jerusalem Post and other media outlets. And I don't know that how often these letters make an impact directly on the highest levels of policy making in Israel, but these are closely read by a large number of English speakers here in Israel.
Okay.
We'll move to our next question. What is the motivation of Israeli media to sabotage the reputation of Israel?
Oh.
It's a big question.
Yeah.
There's a book about that, by the way,
to be honest, I think that the answer is from other field that we are not dealing with. It's a political question. I believe that the answer is dealing with they used to be there are people, those people used to be the majority. I mean the group that ruled the country until 1977. it's dealing with politics, and I prefer not to deal with that. It's not a question about a professional journalism, but political views and emotions.
Are there any hints in your book that could answer this question?
Yes, indeed.
So maybe that you can say something from your book that addresses the question, or maybe if you can't get into the motivation because that's going inside somebody's mind. And a camera, unless we have a direct indication of why somebody did something that we did, we are really, like you are, hesitant to name motive, right? If we can't read inside their mind. Sometimes we have an illuminating tweet, which really gives us an inside view of what somebody is thinking. But maybe you can talk about some of the factors, some of the things you discuss in your book that lead to the situation in which you see so many distortions and misinformation about Israel coming out of this country.
We see that the level, or I would say the temperature of the critics, unjustified critics against Israel, is rising up and up within during the time goes on. And when those journalists, to be honest, most of them in Haaretz, but not all of them, realized that the chance that their parties will control will win the elections and control the country again it's coming. I mean, they don't see it happening again. Then their critics became more poisoned and bad and unfair, because it's not a matter of a professional of journalism or professionality. It's a matter of, I think, that they took away my country. This country is mine, and now they took it. So I will say dirty things about them outside, in order to bring superpowers like the United States, like I don't know, Russia, or the European Union, to force them to go with my policy. That's how I see it.
You're reminding me of a very difficult to listen to remark by former editor-in-chief of Haaretz to Condoleezza Rice. Am I remembering the personalities involved correctly?
No.
Was there not a former editor of Haaretz who said to Condoleezza Rice that he would like the United States to rate?
Yeah. David Landau. Yes.
So that
Please help us. Please help us against our against the Likud.
And I don't know how you fit him in on the level of 1 to 10, where he is on the level of extremists, or there are even more beyond him, or is he somewhere? Is not to the center, but I don't know if you see mainstream characters working in the Israeli media who are even more fringe than he was.
Yeah, I think the guys. I'm not Aluf Ben. Aluf Ben is a moderate.
That is the current editor of Aluf Ben.
Yeah, Aluf Ben is a moderate. Is Zionist, unlike others in his newspaper. In Haaretz, there is I would say there is a fight between two kinds of journalists inside the newspaper. It's the Zionist from one side and the post-Zionist from the other side. And the publisher, the owner, Amos Shoken, he made a decision to go to give the power to the post-Zionist in his newspaper, and the outcome of that was that many of the Zionist journalists left the newspaper, and even a former editor-in-chief of Haaretz, which his name is Hanoch Marmari, when he resigned, he left the newspaper. He told me, he interviewed to Perspectiva, and he told me on his own words that the Haaretz became Haaretz actually is not part of the Israeli society as it used to be, because it goes far to the left by a decision of Shokin. So it's not something I think by myself. Marmari said
that.
What?
He published a piece expressing these views. Hanoch Marmari.
In Perspectiva.
Yes.
Yeah. It's terrible because Haaretz, on the other side, we have to admit that when they are not talking about us and the enemy or how they want the country to look like and under which values, it's a great newspaper. It's a very good newspaper in other terms of journalism. It's the best newspaper in Israel. What makes it so tragic that this is so negative? At the bottom line, it's a negative newspaper. It's a negative institution. It goes against the country in its tools. Yet this is a very good newspaper that I like to read every Shabbat, every day.
I also enjoy reading it. And you said something the other day when you were talking about how all the Israeli media outlets, almost all of them, got wrong. They took a story that was based on a British paper, a British tabloid. Daily, which paper was it?
Daily Mail.
The Daily Mail. And it was a really baseless story with no substantiation that Putin would be retiring in January. And they all ran with
because he has Parkinson.
Right. And it wasn't reported anywhere else internationally because nobody gave it any credibility because it didn't deserve any. And Haaretz was the only one not to report it. So that was I thought that was very surprising. Like
No, it wasn't. That's the thing. It wasn't surprise at all, because Haaretz they have a high standard of professionality, but just until they deal with the Israel-Arab conflict and the way they think the Israeli state should look like, that's the paradox that we are living with, unfortunately.
Fascinating. We have time for one more question, which I'm taking from the audience. Why does the Palestinian narrative gain such credibility and support in the US and the rest of the world, while the Israeli narrative gains no traction? What can be done to reverse the blaming of Israel for all of the problems in the region?
It's a question for the Prime Minister of Israel, or I don't know, not for me. I think that we all should. We are in a big fight about how do you say atoda'ah in English?
Awareness.
Yeah, about in this battle, everybody should be soldiers. We will do media criticism, and other will do other things. Like there are many Zionist organizations who works. I don't know what in our arena. We should keep doing what we do, which is to correct unfair critics against Israel.
Absolutely. It's a fight that Perspectiva is keeping up on its side, keeping the Israeli media honest, and we're doing on the American, British, in the Christian media, as well as in Spanish, Arabic. And we're dealing with it on a very international level. And in that way, we're able to push back and make a difference. Before we wrap up, Hanan, I really want to thank you. You've made it very clear that when coming from Israeli sources, falsehoods about Israel are especially damaging, gaining undeserved credibility and reverberating around the world. But you also spoke very convincingly about Perspectiva's positive impact constantly reminding journalists that they have a responsibility to their own public, to get the facts right, to work according to professional standards, and to correct when necessary. So thank you to the entire Perspectiva team, whether they're in the trenches on Twitter, making their case on radio and television, or expertly researching and crafting important analyses which provide documentation of media failures. Thank you, and thank you to our listeners. Let me again encourage Hebrew speakers to view Perspectiva's work at www.perspectiva.org.il. And for the non-Hebrew speakers, the Camera site, www.camera.org, carries translations of select Perspectiva work, which is relevant to the international media. Stay tuned, of course, for more Camera webinars. That concludes tonight's program. Thank you again, everyone.